Next presentation that will take us through to the lunch break is with another just brilliant keynote speaker, Shalmali, Guttal, who is the Executive Director of Focus on the Global South. She has worked in India and the US and mainland Southeast Asia. She has also produced and continues to produce valuable research commenting on economic development, trade and investment, and ecological and social justice issues in Asia. Shalmali will be sharing her critique of the way in which international NGOs have shaped the course and politics of development. Please make her feel very welcome.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I guess it's noon already, so thank you very much to ACFID for inviting me. Thank you all of you for listening to me, and to the owners of this land for welcoming us here. My organization, that's Focus, is a regional NGO. So we are an NGO, we're based in Asia. We analyze development policy and practice. We share our analysis through seminars, publications, and other political education activities at multiple levels and locations. Our audiences are varied, and they include people's movements, what many people call social movements, unions, grassroots networks, different types of NGOs. We work a lot with legislators and policymakers, academics and students. So my remarks apply as much to my organization as they might to any of yours. I don't exempt Focus from the critique I have of the NGO world or of the development world. Also, I don't know that much about Australian NGOs, so I will limit my remarks to NGOs in general and the development world in general. To begin with, I think, thank you to Richard, Mr. Moore, for providing a very broad and helpful summary of the regional and global context of development financing and some of the key pitfalls such as supply-driven aid, cargo and charity cults, infusions of capital in limited absorption situations, and so on. I think one addition I would make here is we can change labels and we can change words, but we need to be careful that changing words and labels and language also means changing the concepts and underlying meaning behind that terminology. Now, many of the questions that NGOs grapple with regarding relevance, effectiveness, impacts, governance, accountability, and so on, they mirror both changing trends in development discourse and practice, as well as the failure of development itself to adequately address the most enduring and indeed shameful conditions of our times. And I think all of you know what those are. This includes hunger, malnutrition, inequality, inequity, poverty, violence, racism, sexism, and discrimination against others. And I think all of you know very well, reading the newspaper and seeing in your own societies and the world, that these others can be identified on the basis of pretty much anything that power elites choose. You can make a sexual minority an other, you can put religious minorities as others, you can do otherisms on the basis of color, gender, just about anything. Now, over the past few decades, development has become a massive global industry with many different arms. There's the knowledge production and distribution arm, which is big business in itself, because not only do ideas matter, but they also sell. And there are plenty of experts out there and among us who come up with concepts, theories, tools, manuals, and so on. Then there is the arm of development practice, which involves translating the lofty goals of development into activities, projects, programs, and so on. Here, again, we have more expertise. We have more toolboxes, frameworks for planning, scenario building, theories of change, and so on. And then, of course, the actual implementation of the activities in the field. Then there is the arm of financing, development financing, which involves a wide range of actors, bilateral, multilateral, donors of different types, INGOs, religious institutions, there are political parties and foundations, and of course there are corporate foundations. And philanthrocapitalism has expanded by leaps and bounds, and we have dollar billionaires in transnational corporations who all jumped into the development fray, and they're forming all these different consortia with financiers, governments, NGOs, and so on, the UN, civil society organizations, and they're blazing these trails of corporate social responsibility and multi-stakeholderism, but at the same time eluding national laws and what I would argue is genuine accountability. Now, NGOs, whether they're local, national, international, regional, are involved in at least one or many of these arms. And depending on our beliefs, our purposes, our values, we can play negative, positive, transformative, or status quo roles. But before I go further into NGO roles, I would like to problematize some key issues regarding development, which I think are very key and germane to what the future of NGOs will be. The first is the performance of development. How is it actually fair in bringing about the well-being of the majority? Now, for over 60 years, development has defined acceptable and unacceptable standards of life for the world's peoples. Now, these are based on particular values and resource use, and I think Richard's already identified and elaborated on the whole North-South issue and how development has moved sort of in unidirectional ways, no? But so certainly advancements have been made in many areas, such as medical and other sciences, public health, education, industry and communication and digital technologies, information, knowledge systems, and so on. But of course, development interventions have touched all aspects of social, cultural, economic, and political life, and they have been instrumental in the integration of local and national economies into the global economy. In fact, development has been one of the most powerful political forces in the last 60 years in economic and financial globalization. But development has not resulted in positive and social economic change for the majority, nor has it made significant dents in the structural causes of inequality, poverty, hunger, and other injustices that we seek to address through development. So the world's wealth and assets continue to concentrate in the hands of wealthy elites and transnational corporations. Workers' wages remain low, and precarious employment and unemployment persists in most countries. The climate crisis, environmental pollution, and destruction are deepening. Recurring economic and financial crises seem to be the new normal. We're seeing recurrence of old pathogens of health problems and new viruses multiplying in urban, unlivable environments. And very important, hundreds of thousands of people are being dislocated and displaced from their lands, environments, and territories because of destructive investments, land and water grabbing, and natural disasters and wars. In fact, most wars and conflicts that result in the massive floods of refugees and migrants are related to access and control over natural wealth, land, territories, and associated identities. Today, development is described and planned in the language of free markets, free trade agreements, private, often corporate investments, private sector expansion, and business plans. And this is the terrain that we NGOs have to operate in now and in the future. If we look at development trends in Asia, development is characterized by an obsession with economic growth, which is operationalized through privatization, trade and investment liberalization, and market and corporate-friendly regulation. Human rights, the environment, and justice are easily sacrificed to keep investments and capital flowing and to keep markets functioning. Public interest is being redefined and expressed in market terms. Public-private partnerships serve as covers for privatization of critical sectors such as water, healthcare, education, energy, transportation, and even security. So the entire realm of development is moving into market public-private partnership areas. Now there's certainly a huge increase in wealthy people and middle classes, but this is accompanied by an equivalent increase in inequality and precarious employment. I would argue that much of Asia's wealth increases have come from what the eminent scholar David Harvey refers to as accumulation by dispossession. And an important cause of inequality and poverty is the capture of land, water, and natural wealth by rich elites, by governments, businesses, corporations, and even by many international NGOs for a variety of purposes. It's speculation, real estate property development, industrial agriculture, energy production, and extractive industry. And this, where NGOs come in, is the capture and closure of lands and territories for conservation purposes, and market-based offset projects such as red and blue carbon. And these captures and enclosures are legal. Regulations and laws are being rewritten to enable them, and they're justified in the name of economic development. Development in Asia is also accompanied by a great deal of violence by state forces, which include police and military, and private security companies and militias hired by private investors and other claimants to land, water, forests, and minerals. Individuals and communities who stand up for their rights are criminalized by laws that make it illegal to resist or even protest against destructive investment projects that are promoted as development. So narratives of economic growth, progress, nation building, national security, social stability, peace, and even happiness, as in Thailand, are being used as justifications by governments to silence dissent and opposition. If you speak out against this model of development, you are labeled anti-development, anti-social, and anti-state. And really, no one is safe. Believe me, we live and work in that area. You could be a union leader, you could be a peasant leader, you could be an NGO, you could be a student, lawyer, writer, journalist. Anybody can be targeted and criminalized if you oppose this model of development. So many communities that we work with say very clearly, if this is development, we don't want it. Please leave us in peace. But at the same time, what's happening? People aren't just sitting by and letting things happen to them, no? So the dysfunction and dangers of failed formulas have become evident to the so-called subjects of development. I think people see very clearly that while the body of knowledge, practices, and systems that inform development continue to expand, development itself has become a phenomenon to be resisted from the standpoints of justice, human rights, equality, climate, and well-being. So people have realized that they can't trust their governments, corporations, markets, or other actors to adequately address their problems, nor can they wait for global institutions to change. They can't wait, and they won't wait for NGOs to come up with yet another model, yet another way of addressing their problems. So they must themselves become directly involved in identifying and implementing solutions, and in the political work that is needed to ensure that solutions are systemic, multi-level, democratic, sustainable, and just. And they are doing that. So we see peasants, fisherfolk, workers, indigenous peoples, rural and urban poor, women and youth, they're joining forces, they're joining hands to protect their food systems, their jobs, their environments, communities' rights, and their political processes. Governance is very important, but it's essentially a political process. And their people are wanting to reclaim governance and their political processes. They're educating themselves and others and building strategic, multi-level, cross-sectoral, and intergenerational resistance to global capitalism, to neoliberalism, and to corporate hegemony. And nurturing and building alternatives to the financial and economic systems that are central to the dominant development model are crucial elements of this growing popular resistance. And it is from such organizing that emerge meta-narratives of well-being, rights, peace, and justice, such as food sovereignty, agroecology, the commons and commoning, defense of people's territories, deglobalization, when vivere, workers' cooperatives, and local governance systems. There are many such alternatives that people are put in practice in local areas and are scaling up to subnational and national levels, and they're making regional and international movements across. Their challenge to globalization is internationalization, which is an old workers' rallying cry, but I'm sure many of you in Australia know, because Australia used to have a very vibrant workers' movement, I think. Now, these alternatives challenge the hegemony of development model that is promoted by both neoliberalism and also outdated bureaucratic state socialism. And these meta-narratives inspire a reimagining of development as a process rooted in the non-negotiable rights to self-determination of affected peoples. They also openly confront dominant power structures, whether these are political, social, gender, or money power. So now coming back to the questions for NGOs. If these trends continue of internationalization and alternatives or new ways of imagining development built by social movements, and I believe they will, then I think it's useful for all of us NGOs to work through some, I think, what I consider key issues. The first is, how will NGOs challenge different types of power, which includes class power, money, culture, race, and gender, different types of power. To date, NGOs have not been able to change the politics and course of development towards a substantively progressive direction. Instead, NGOs have more or less adapted themselves to changing political and economic conditions, and some believe that one has to take an incremental approach to bring about change and retain the seat on the table so you can keep talking with policymakers. But in the process, and many NGOs have become too embedded and vested in the very structures that need to be changed. Now, development is political. I've heard many development organizations saying, we do development, not politics. But really, what could be more political than making decisions about how the resources of a society are used? Who benefits from these decisions? Who benefits from how the resources are used? How are citizens protected and their potential enhanced? And how are diverse communities and peoples are given opportunities to progress? These decisions involve the exercise of power, and NGOs have to accept fair and square that we are all, every day in our work, exercising power one way or another. And if we look at multi-stakeholder approaches, which have become very, very popular of late, this is a very good example. Now, without proactive measures to address power asymmetries between politically well-connected investors, affected communities, and government officials, existing unequal power structures and relations continue to be reproduced. Whether the multi-stakeholder negotiation is about compensation for dam and use displacement, or division of land for industrial agriculture, or wage negotiations for workers. And here, women are especially vulnerable to these power asymmetries because of multiple layers of power that they have to negotiate, whether it's patriarchy, at home or in the workplace, or in their communities and traditional societies. The second question is, how will NGOs learn new knowledge and learn how to learn new knowledge? Many national and international NGOs have the money to hire consultants to produce and disseminate knowledge, make sure it gets into policy circles, and set the tones of discourse. Now, by publicizing their own analyses repeatedly, NGOs convert their own views of reality into social facts, crowding out other views, analyses, pictures, and knowledges, especially from the very populations that they're supposed to be serving. Analytical frameworks abound. Theories of change, strategic planning, scenario building, smart log frames, etc. And all these analytical frameworks are very useful for planning, sure. But what they try to do is they try and fit the messy world of reality into the tidy categories of these frameworks. This entails abstraction and generalization, which then increase the disconnect between the real life, material, and political conditions of that mass of people who are supposed to be developed and the development establishment. And such types of knowledge creation also become self-fulfilling prophecies. They claim to capture and express realities and propose actions to address them. But in the process, perhaps unwittingly, they reproduce the structures of exclusion and oppression that actually need to be dismantled. I have met many agricultural experts who make agricultural policy, but they don't know how to grow food. I know lots of biodiversity experts who wouldn't survive a day in a forest unless a local forest community person told them what kind of, where is water safe to drink, what plants are edible, what mushrooms are okay to eat. There's too much knowledge being produced that is alienated from people and communities, and that is alienating people and communities. And it's marginalizing local knowledge, technologies, and capabilities. I mean, people are not without knowledge. People are not without capabilities. People have survived and will continue to survive. And I think it's unconscionable that we as NGOs support elite knowledge preserves and knowledge systems. The third question that I would put before us is the issue of alliances, accountability, and governance. And I know this is a very sensitive topic, and I'm putting myself in the same basket as all NGOs. In some situations, NGOs are viewed by peoples affected by crises as ambulance chasers, converting crises into opportunities for themselves. And as crises abound, which they do, and with climate there will be even more, with the climate change crisis, there will be more and more opportunities for NGOs to become intermediaries, to take that techno-fix, bring it to the people, to do development, in different ways. Now, the surge of philanthropicapitalism and changes in government aid policies have led to NGO private sector alliances, multi-stakeholder processes, and parallel governance systems that undermine NGO and corporate accountability, as well as undermining the social political contracts between people and their governments. So it can be asked whether NGOs set up constituencies as beneficiaries so that the survival and perpetuation of these constituencies actually depend on the survival of the NGOs. I have been in many multi-stakeholder meetings and many sort of corporate social responsibility and global compact type meetings where local communities, workers, peasants, citizen groups say to us that, they say, why are you interfering between us and the governments? We elect our governments. We are citizens. We want to hold our governments legally responsible. We have constitutions, we have laws. Why are you NGOs coming along with parallel governance systems? Who are you speaking for? And I think this is a very important question. So who should NGOs be politically accountable to? Well, in my view, is that we should be equally accountable, if not more accountable, to the constituencies that we're supposed to be serving, as to those who give us funds. Now, this in turn calls for a renegotiation of our own roles in the development establishment and challenging the role of the development industry itself in recreating the conditions that allow the development industry to flourish, rather than effectively tackling the roots and structures of the problems that development is supposed to address. So then that takes me to the fourth question, which is another sensitive issue. Again, I put myself in the same basket as all NGOs with this sensitive issue, which is that of professionals, people, and risks. Now, just as development is an industry, those in the industry are professionals. The upheavals of the industry affect them insofar as their own future jobs and salary prospects are concerned. But how vulnerable are development professionals to crises and risks on the ground, aside from those, of course, who are in war and conflict zones? Let me give you an example. When an agriculture extension program goes wrong, local farmers face deeper debt and economic hardships, which lead to increased poverty and distressed migration. When a conservation or RED project sets off conflicts between local communities and the state, people in the affected areas experience repression, intimidation, arrests, and even violence. But the development experts who have designed the projects and programs are relatively unaffected by these. And while, of course, we are likely to be deeply distressed, we can move on and to work on another project elsewhere. This difference between the professionals and people perhaps does much more to undermine the legitimacy of NGOs than many other differences. Who takes the maximum risks in different types of initiatives is a question that we do need to ask. Some very powerful tycoons are targeting a very respected colleague and a friend of mine in Asia. And I warn him every time we meet to be careful. When I meet him and I talk to him and I say, you have to be careful, you can't put yourself out there, you have a wife, you have children, people depend on you. And his response always is, when we take on this type of advocacy work, we must be prepared to face the risks. He's right, of course. But the thing is that such risks are increasing, and there are too few of us who take these risks. We need many more risk takers. We need many more professionals who are willing to be people and not professionals, who are willing to be the risk takers. So the future of well-being, or the future of well-being that is in harmony with nature, with the earth, with Mother Earth, I think it's with social movements. It's with social movements and people organizing, articulating, acting, and rebuilding dignified, respectful, and diverse societies from the ground up. I don't think it's with the techno-fixes or with the alienated knowledge systems that the development industry or the reinvented corporate development industry is poised and ready to do, and is already producing and doing. It's a very different type of future that we have to envisage. And I hope NGOs will join this type of future. And I mean, it's not just enough to say, well, will NGOs work themselves out of a job, or will NGOs stay out of the state, get out of the way? NGOs have a lot of power. And even by staying out of the way, my time's coming up, yes, I know. 2 minutes, okay. We have to not just not be part of the problem. Let's try and be part of a really sustainable solution. And in closing, I'd just like to give a small anecdote. I'm from India. In southern India, I don't know, many of you may have heard, in the state of Kerala, in a place called Lachivara, communities waged a huge struggle against Coca-Cola. And a lot of students from the United States and other places contacted people there. They went to visit the communities and they said, how can we support your struggle? And the leaders of the community said, don't support our struggle. We have lots of supporters. Join the struggle. That's what we need. And students did. And we see what happened with that. Coca-Cola was banned from many college campuses. And so, and this is what the communities that we go to, that Focus goes to, we try to do this. We try and join struggles. And that's my invitation to all of you too. Let's join struggles. Let's see how we can actually work towards a future that isn't trapped in the old edifices of the aid industry, nor does it become captive to new versions of the same old formula, but with new labels. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Shalmali. I think it was an incredibly important session because I think you were both, from your different angles, suggesting the same level of self-imposed disruption. You've both left us with a lot to think about, no less provocative than Richard. I think a very telling set of stories for us to reflect upon.